George English again. So thank you for joining us. And this time we're going to look at the Mayflower and what happened after they landed. We've done the development and going the dreadful journey over there. So we're going to look at the early years in New England and also then look at one or two of the individuals who were part of this historic event. So the first year, 1620 to 21, they got there in mid-November, you may remember. So the first thing they did was to explore the coast, and they had what's called a shallop, a small ship that could take perhaps a dozen people, and they would go on the coast and see what they could find and so forth, higher and lower. And then, of course, December, winter arrives, and so the conditions were really bad. They elected John Carver as their first governor, but he, in fact, was to die the following spring. And then William Bradford, who we mentioned earlier, took over as governor and was governor for, as we see, 36 years, a very important individual in those early years. There had, of course, been others who had gone to the New World, migrants. They identified things like commodities to extract from the fields, the woods and forests, and fish and marine life that could be eaten. So there was some knowledge. Of course, people lived on the land, and in early December there was an attack with arrows by natives, which didn't come to anything, fortunately. And there they had no accommodation. They stayed on the ship and would explore from there. And then some luck. A miracle happened during Christmas. They found that an abandoned native village which had been decimated by a plague. And we'll talk about the native Indians in a moment, called the Wampanoag. But disease and death was there everywhere. There was scurvy on the ship, a lack of shelter, and in February and March, 2 to 3 people a day were dying. 45, almost half of those people died at that time. And then in March, they made a treaty with the Wampanoag Indians, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And this worked very well. They formed the treaty, they worked with each other, the Wampanoag showed them things like skills and how to do that, and very much helped them to survive those early months. And the Mayflower eventually went back to London 5 months after it arrived on the 5th of April. Now, the Wampanoag tribe I've mentioned, they were the natives to where the Plymouth colony was established, and a piece of both good and bad news, Squanto was an Indian who actually had been abducted by an English trader and sold as a slave in Europe. But he learnt English there, and when he came home, many of his own tribe had died, probably of plague in what's been known as the Great Dying of 1616 to 1690. But many of the villages were active and were trading all around the eastern seaboard. And Squanto had learnt English, so there was someone who could actually act as interpreter between the Pilgrims and the Indians. And in March 1620, the Wampanoag signed this treaty with the Pilgrims, and they taught them these basic skills of survival, such as growing corn. Of course, by now it's early spring, and so it was a good time for planting. But just to add to that, this graphic depiction of those early pilgrims. You can see the families. There were single people, there were families of 3 or 4 children with servants and so on and so forth. The black figures are those who survived. The grey browny figures are those who didn't. There were whole families who died, who were decimated. Such a tragedy. Some families survived, but over half of those pilgrims died by the first Thanksgiving in the autumn of 1621. Thanksgiving is a word that will register with some of you, and we'll talk about that more next time. But now let's look at the passengers themselves. Thanks to the writings, everyone who was on that is known, and 50 of those are known to have living descendants. There are 35 million descendants of those 50 around the world. And in terms of family history, what better thing than the fact that for each one of those, there is an accurate book published of the first possibly 4 or 5 generations. The books have looked at incorrect claims as well as legitimate claims. And so you can buy a book of your ancestor, being fairly sure the information in there is good. There's a society Mayflower Society in every state and for most pilgrims. And this expression is so true. All people are living histories. I have a special interest in this because I had an ancestor on the Mayflower. And so all of this is important to me. And his name was Richard Warren. So there, he's born about 1580. So he's about 40 when he gets to New England. And they now have the Plymouth Plantation America, where actors play the parts of some of those early pilgrims. So I have actually met my ancestor from 400 years ago, a strange experience. The big shame was I so wanted to tell him that I was descended from him and so on, but he didn't know anything after 1627 when the character he was playing met. So let's look at him in a bit of detail, because like most of the people on the Mayflower, we know very little about their lives before they left England. In this case, we do know that Richard Warren was a merchant from London, a stranger. His marriage to Elizabeth Walker in 1610 has been found, and they had 5 daughters before he left them all behind and sailed on the Mayflower. And those daughters, Mary, Anna, Sarah, Elizabeth, and Abigail, they finally came out with their mother in 1623, 3 years later. Just think, he didn't even know if he would get to the other side of the world, let alone if he'd ever see them again. And then they had 2 further sons while they were in Plymouth, Nathaniel and Joseph. And this is the record written by William Bradford. How can we know that this happened? And what's interesting, of course, I mentioned how there are probably more than 1 million descendants of Richard Warren. And so much work has been done. So much work has been done by individuals who are trying to see if they are descended from someone on the Mayflower. And in the case of Richard Warren, of course, there are some well-known people who are descended from him. So I have, as very, very distant cousins, Henry Longfellow, the poet, Ulysses Grant, the president, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, also president of America, Ernest Hemingway, Orson Welles, Alan Shepard, the astronaut who went to the moon,